Good morning. My name is Richard Cope. I'm the Senior Trends Consultant at Mintel. I'm here today to talk to you about how we're going to sell sustainability into consumers. And I want to start the presentation with this quote from John Lennon from the late 60s, where talking about his War is Over peace movement with Yoko Ono, he said, we're trying to sell peace like a product and sell it like people sell soap or soft drinks. And that's really intrinsic to the way we're looking at sustainability in this presentation. It is something we have to sell and market like any other product into consumers. And we mustn't forget all the other factors which make us choose to buy into a particular product and service. My point is people aren't going to buy into sustainable or ethical products and services purely because they're ethical and sustainable. We have to sell in their other qualities as well. So why are we here today? Well, consumerism is going to be so important towards us achieving equality, towards us achieving sustainability in the future. The IEA says that consumers' choices, consumers' behaviours are going to account for almost 60% of the emissions reductions we need to hit to achieve net zero by 2050. So consumers, their products and services are really going to be so important to us achieving those goals going forward. So we're going to have three sections we look at today during this presentation. In the first part here, I want to look at the research at Mintel we have around consumers' beliefs and consumers' behaviours when it comes to sustainability. Now, this chart here is looking at the current and potential shares of homes around the world that have air conditioning. So that small icon is the current penetration. Sorry, that small icon is the current levels of penetration. The bigger figure you're seeing is what that penetration would increase to if everybody who wanted aircon was going to get it. Now, this is really informative. I could have shown you a slide showing you proportions of people who believe in climate change or global warming, but I think this is a really good way of showing it from a consumer perspective. The fact that so many people are interested in getting into aircon tells you the fact that they're accepting we are living in a warming world. The other key thing we're seeing from a consumer point of view is that consumers do still think there's time to make a difference. The chart we're looking at here is people's responses to two statements. One, the darker green, if we act now, we still have time to save the planet. And the second is whether people think their behavior can make a positive difference to the environment. And what we see is the optimism in the former statement is closely tied to that belief that consumers do feel they can make a difference. Now, this presents a huge opportunity for brands. The opportunity for brands is to become the chosen partners for consumers who are looking to make a difference. That's the easy part. The challenge is going to be maintain that relationship thereafter, that proving that by shopping with you, by buying a specific product from you, they are making a difference by doing that. Now, if we look at how consumers behave and purchase in relation to sustainability, we can look at whether they're proactive or not. So this chart here is looking at solar power penetration. In terms of panels in people's home, the dark brown is the current penetration levels. You can see it's pretty low. It's dominated by countries in the Asia Pacific region. But in the middle, this orange segment shows huge proportions of consumers are potentially interested in investing in this. And what we see in electric vehicles, again, it's particularly strong in North Asia. It's weak outside of that. We see big proportions of consumers realistically interested in buying into this in the near future. And if you look at that in Europe, again, if you look at current penetration levels of electric vehicles, they are particularly low. Now, these icons tell you the proportion of homes in these countries which have cars. So something like Italy, really automotive nation, 89% of Italian households having a car. That's just 7% of those are electric vehicles. But then if we look on the right, if everybody says they're interested in owning an electric vehicle was to do that, you can see how high that penetration would go. So the desire from consumers to invest in big ticket sustainable products and services is definitely there. The question is, how do we tap into it? Well, let's look at some more staple products. Let's go down from cars and let's look at coffee. This is a question we asked about the most important factors be product or not. And what we see here in this chart is we've got these green figures, which are very pleasing to see. Big proportions of consumers consider whether the coffee comes in minimal packaging that can be recycled or not. Big proportions considering whether it's produced in an environmentally friendly way. And that's great to see in third and fourth position there. But what's more important to me here is the red figures. These are the red lines. So it's important to consider what consumers won't sacrifice for sustainability. And quite clearly, that is quality, it's brand familiarity as well. So we must never discount this idea of the pleasure principle, particularly when we look at things in relation to packaging. So the cardinal rule of packaging must be that it protects the product inside the packaging and secures its shelf life. Because the energy footprint, the water footprint of that product is going to be much higher than the packaging itself. And we must just need to stop that from being wasted, first of all. So it's very useful to bear this in mind. The red lines consumers won't cross, what they won't sacrifice for sustainability. So we need to make sure our sustainable or ethical products hit these marks before we start looking at sustainable qualities. And when we look at what people do, we've asked people what they've done in terms of sustainable behaviors in the past 12 months. Very clearly, the most popular behaviors are driven by simplicity, they're driven by frugality. The most common practice is people returning packaging to stores or recycling packaging themselves. And that's a really good example of companies partnering with consumers when it comes to packaging being returned to stores. And the old adage here is abstinence costs nothing. Reducing consumption is what consumers need to do most to help with sustainability. Reducing consumption conserves resources, and it obviously conserves money for consumers as well. So you can see frugality is something obviously comes in and informs things like meal planning or people buying fewer new clothes. I'd like to introduce another concept here as well, that idea of individuality. Individuality is one of the things we can appeal to in consumers to try and sell in sustainability. So people buying fewer new clothes doesn't preclude them from using things like fashion resellers or trying to get something that gives them a more individual, unique look. And indeed, when we categorize consumers as being sustainably minded at Mintel, what we see is they're more likely to over-index on a statement like, I have a budget that I try to stick to as much as possible. They're also more likely to answer in the affirmative that they like to stand out from the crowd. So that's introducing that theme of looking at non-sustainable, non-ethical factors in how we can target them. Probably the biggest driver in sustainable purchasing is health. If we look at this in the context of transport, there's been a lot of publicity, I think, about how people were climbing in their cars more during the pandemic and it's causing more road traffic emissions. In fact, the biggest behavior shift we saw in the last 12 months was toward micromobility. So the biggest shift was people cycling more often, people walking more often, rather than taking any form of transport. And again, when we cross-index these consumers, we also see they're more likely to agree with the statement, it's more important for me to lead an active lifestyle. So health is an enormous driver when it comes to sustainability. So the key takeaways in terms of people's behaviors would be, firstly, the huge proportions of people we saw aspiring to buy air conditioners confirms for us the belief in climate change. It also introduces that idea of well-being being a key purchasing driver in terms of how we sell in sustainability. The good news is consumers do feel they can be the change, but that is in the balance. The opportunity for brands is to become those chosen partners to help those consumers who are trying to have an impact. When we look at staple products, we looked at coffee as an example, we can see people do purchase sustainably to a degree, but they have red lines. They won't compromise on brand quality. They won't compromise on brand familiarity in the name of sustainability. If you look at solar panels, if you look at electric vehicles, there's clear evidence that people are gearing up to purchase these big ticket sustainable items. But if that's going to happen successfully, we need to make sure that we tap into people's desire for things which are simple, things which are frugal, save them money, or things which help with their health. You know, clearly that's the argument to make around things like electric vehicles and solar panels. Long term, it's going to be a financial reward for that. And that's probably how they need to be marketed, rather than something which is simply going to improve the planet. Okay, in the second section, we'd like to look at some of the research we have, which poses some big challenges for consumer-facing companies. And the big one is the fact that consumers hold companies highly responsible for lots of environmental issues and lots of social issues. So here in this spider chart, you can see the blue line indicates where consumers hold companies most responsible on certain issues. The dark green is consumers. You can see them hold themselves rather far less responsible in other sectors. And then the light green, you have governments. So what we're seeing here is that consumers hold companies most responsible, that's more than governments, for increasing recycling, for ensuring fair conditions and fair pay for workers, and for reducing emissions from road and air transport. So some big tasks being laid at the door of companies by consumers. Whether this is wrong or right is not the issue. They hold companies responsible for taking action on these issues. When we ask consumers about their top environmental concerns, here we're looking at a chart compiling all our global data, people to ask to choose up to 3 top concerns, and these are the ones which would figure in that. So the most popular responses are climate change, global warming, followed by air quality, followed by plastic pollution. And this is very telling because consumers prioritize things that are tangible, climate change, things they can start to see for themselves, things that are threatening to their health and well-being. Again, I see that as a massive driver in air quality. And then things that are highly visible to them, like plastic pollution. Now, of course, if we'd run those questions with environmental scientists, we would have got a very different set of results. But consumers aren't environmental scientists, at least not yet. They don't make considerations around based on the knowledge of how many greenhouse gas emissions are emitted by certain processes or certain products. Now here we're looking at a chart which sort of maps, the emissions we produce every year and where those come from. And you can see energy is the dominant force here, followed by agriculture, forestry, land use, followed by industrial processes. And then on the right, we have waste. So waste actually generates a minuscule amount of emissions compared with energy itself. Yet it's a much bigger concern for consumers. Now, the responsibility of brands is obviously to bring in some education here and actually focus on the areas of their business which have the biggest impact here, not just the ones that consumers are most conscious about as well. And they really have a responsibility to take action in the most impactful and relevant way for their business. And consumers will become more informed about this as time goes on. Now, another way to think about the emissions that come from consumer-facing products and services is how do they impact on carbon storage? So all those products and services we buy, and indeed the environmental solutions brands are proffering, we can evaluate those in terms of how they affect the amount of carbon that's stored in the sea, in the soil, or in plants and animals. And if you look at this chart here on the right, that sort of shows you how carbon moves between these different reservoirs of atmosphere, soil, biomass, and the sea as well. So we understand that if we start chopping down forests, that's releasing lots of carbon. Plant biomass holds 500 gigatons there. Impressive. That's nothing compared to the soil, where the figure goes up to 2,300 gigatons, and that is all dwarfed by the ocean, which holds 37,000 gigatons as well. So what this means is things like cultivation, deforestation, overfishing, fertilizer runoff, all of these things, which are synonymous with consumer-facing goods, can all transfer this stored carbon into the atmosphere and contribute to global warming as well. And this is the way consumers are going to start thinking about these issues going forward. As I mentioned, at the moment, the consumer concerns don't necessarily match up with emissions. One area where consumers are quite attuned to some of those issues we talked about is around agriculture. Obviously, agriculture, including land use, forestry, all of that impacts very heavily on the amount of carbon stored in soil and biomass as well. If we till the land, we're releasing carbon. If we chop down trees, we're releasing carbon, as well as we're aware of the role of livestock and things like that as well. 72% of all consumers globally select one of deforestation, loss of biodiversity on land, chemicals enter the environment is one of their top 3 environmental concerns. So they are very attuned across the world to the idea that agriculture, food sourcing has a big impact on the environment. Where we get a bit of a disconnect is when we look at something like plastic pollution, for example. Here we're looking at a chart of consumers who've ranked ocean plastics one of their top 3 concerns right across the world. You can see usually a majority of consumers have ranked this as one of their top 3 concerns. Ocean plastic actually generates relatively few emissions. The chart we looked at previously, waste as a whole generates around 3%. If we're being very generous and consider all the elements of plastic production, incineration, it still at most contributes around 3.6% of global emissions. Yet it really captures the public imagination. In fact, ocean biodiversity is a much bigger, more impactful issue. 90% of the excess heat from greenhouse gases since the 70s has already been absorbed by the ocean. And actually, biodiversity in the oceans, fishing, ocean plastic, these are actually intertwined concerns. When we look at something like the studies done by Sea Shepherd, we found that actually the big Great Pacific garbage patches, actually almost half of that plastic is fishing nets. So these are intertwined issues. My point is, as time goes by, activism, journalism, education, consumers are going to become more aware of these issues, and brands are going to have to be more transparent about the realities of where they need to take action. Now, I don't want this presentation to be all about bad news and doom and gloom. Throughout, I'll pepper it for a few examples of some of the best-in-class solutions we're seeing from around the world to offer solutions which brands can embrace as part of their sustainability policies. One of those is about improving biodiversity in the oceans to really boost carbon sequestration, carbon storage we looked at. Things like mangroves, they cover just 2% of marine environments, yet they account for up to 15% of the carbon stored. Seagrasses here on the right cover just 0.2% of the seafloor, yet absorb 10% of all the carbon dioxide stored in the ocean. Extremely powerful reservoirs. And we are seeing all these kind of initiatives to improve the coverage of these, conservation programs, planting programs. You can revisit these with the links at the bottom of the page to just reinforce the power of these kind of ocean biodiversity projects. A typical square kilometre of territorial forest will store 30,000 metric tons of carbon. Seagrass will store 83,000 metric tons. So we looked at consumers' concerns. What solutions do consumers think can save the planet? We've asked consumers what environmental solutions do they think are going to have a high to moderate impact. And these highly recognized solutions can be quick wins for companies. But again, the real question for companies is what is genuinely most impactful and what's relevant to your business sector as well. So you can see that consumers think planting new forests or protecting existing forests are the most impactful things companies or governments can do, followed by investments in renewable energy, followed by projects for developing countries to use clean fuels at home. And all of those things are on the money. They are highly impactful things. So these are the kind of things brands can embrace, and that will resonate very strongly with consumers. Some solutions, which are equally laudable, clearly require better levels of education, better positioning if they're going to succeed. If we look at something like food grown in labs, right down here at the bottom, only 48% think that's high impact. It's extremely high impact, but clearly we need to sell that in to consumers more. Now, consumers said that planting new forests was the most impactful thing that companies and governments could do. That's not actually true. Conserving existing forests would be more impactful, because when you conserve an existing forest, it's already mature, it's already absorbing more carbon rather than waiting for a new forest to grow. But I'm kind of nitpicking a little bit here. If we are going to do forestation programs, we need to look at the things which are the most impactful. So World Tree is a company which uses the world's fastest growing hardwood tree. It's all about the kind of trees you choose. The Empress Splendor grows 20 feet tall in its first year, reaches maturity in 10 years, captures 103 metric tons of CO2 per acre compared to just 9.5 by most species. So again, it's about the detail. It's about how impactful the solutions you follow as a company are, and not just paying lip service to things like forestation. So when it comes to challenges for companies, the key thing is consumers hold companies most responsible, that's more than governments, for increasing recycling, ensuring fair conditions and pay for workers, and for reducing emissions from air transport and vehicles as well. And if we look at different sectors, what we see is that passenger transport companies, household product manufacturers, and the meat, poultry, and fish manufacturers are actually held more accountable than other sectors. When we look at concerns, consumers clearly prioritize things which are tangible to them, things which threaten their health, and things which are highly visible to them as well. Now, it's easy for companies to engage on these issues which consumers have already bought into, but what companies need to do is take action on the areas of their business which are most impactful, most relevant to their practices as well. We just looked at solutions, and we can see that consumers perceive things like planting new forests, protecting existing forests, investing in renewable energy as high impact solutions. So companies who make that part of their transition and showcase that highly, that's easily going to resonate with consumers. The challenge is going to be engaging consumers on some of the more impactful issues which don't resonate with them yet. Things like restoring and conserving biomass is one of the most impactful things we can do to store carbon, and that needs to become a greater focus for consumers and companies going forward. So moving on from the challenges, in the final section, I really want to look at some of the solutions. What are the approaches we can take to achieve success in sustainable products and services? Well, let's start by asking, who are the sustainable consumers? Our research at Mintel, we've sort of looked at how people who we would describe as sustainably minded consumers describe themselves, how they consider themselves. So my answer to that question would be sustainable consumers are just like everyone else, only more so. And what I mean by that is they are more likely than average to prize things like value, prize things like convenience. If we look at the statements we've asked people about here, you can see in this chart, the biggest difference between sustainably minded consumers and the average consumer is they're more likely to identify with being part of the community. They try to buy from local companies. They focus on experiences rather than possessions. They focus on things like active lifestyles. And we can see that the way to engage consumers around sustainability is not just selling into sustainability. We need to appeal to convenience, frugality, health, need for de-stress, satisfy people's desire to be individuals, satisfy the egotism they have as well. So if you look at that in terms of electric vehicles, remember the chart I showed you earlier, we saw it was much more developed in North Asia as a market than it is in Europe. Now, ownership of electric vehicles in Europe increases amongst people who say, I like to be the first to try new technology. So it's definitely about tech early adoption, and we need to sell in sustainable solutions which appeal to that sentiment. What we see in a more mature market like China or Japan is ownership of electric vehicles increases amongst people who say, I have a budget and try to stick to it as much as possible. So it's that value proposition, that frugality, which is working in those markets. Now, I mentioned that people we classify as sustainably minded consumers also over-index on wanting to stand out from the crowd. And I want to introduce this campaign by the tech reseller Backmarket. It really does a fantastic job of selling a service which is sustainable, getting people to reuse refurbished tech products rather than buy new ones and use more resources and throw things away in the process. And their freedom campaign really appeals to that desire sustainably minded consumers have for frugality, for individuality as well. So extols the virtues of democratically priced devices and also being different. And you'll see in the video we show for this campaign that it tries to appeal to people's desire to be different from those people who are sort of lining up en masse to buy the new Apple and Samsung product. So let's take a look at this video.
Libérons-nous du neuf. Faites le choix du reconditionné. Des milliers de produits reconditionnés, garantis et jusqu'à 70% moins chers sur backmarket.fr.
Now, I also talked about another key way to appeal to consumers is to make things tangible. We made this argument that seeing is believing when we looked at why something like ocean plastic was such a big concern for consumers. Consumers' concerns are really grounded in what they experience for themselves. So here we're looking at the proportions of people who ranked climate change as one of their key environmental concerns in the red. With the orange data here is people who say they believe the country where they live is suffering from climate change. And again, you can see there's a pretty strong relationship between the two statements. So we can see people are concerned about what they experience for themselves. I think we need to take that learning into the solutions we provide as well. The solutions we provide have to tick the same boxes. Solutions need to be tangible. We need to be able to see how these solutions are working at a local level as well. We looked earlier at the difference between what consumers perceive to be their highest concerns around the environment and what the reality of that is. There's really what I would call a climate reality gap. If we're looking at this chart here, On the right, the map shows the countries which have the highest proportion of greenhouse gases. The more getting into the reds and the browns is when we have a very sort of high level of emissions from those countries. Now, I've used those same colors in the chart here on the left, where people answer whether they think the country where they live is contributing to climate change. So let's look at the Americas on the left here. So Canada, big proportions of consumers conscious of the fact that their country is actually contributing to climate change, and the color on the map tells you they are indeed generating a huge amount of emissions. Go down to the United States, we have much higher level of emissions coming from that country, but a lower level of realization from consumers. Now, it's crucial that we close this gap. The awareness or acceptance of a national or personal impact is essential if we are going to engage people more in sustainability and indeed in sustainable purchasing. And there's a trend here where people really externalize culpability to what I would call producer countries like China and Brazil. So China and Brazil, big manufacturing, growing countries, they produce a lot of emissions. They are producing emissions by producing goods for the people in these countries. And that ushers in a whole new argument we don't really have time to go into around how much emissions are wrapped up in trade. And you're going to see things like carbon border taxes emerge and impact consumerism in the long term. This chart here looks at the proportion of consumers agree that science can provide solutions to the climate crisis. And you can see these figures are pretty low, and this is very disappointing. If we think about the available technologies we have right now, solar panels, batteries, fuel cells, hydroponics, they're crucial to helping reduce our emissions and to give us solutions. And if we think about the technologies in development, carbon capture, climate engineering, zero carbon materials, chemical recycling, lab-grown foods, they are all going to be crucial to helping us hit net zero. In fact, all those pledges you're seeing at COP right now from countries, a lot of this is built on the never, never, if you like. A lot of their statements are built on technologies which haven't even been developed yet. So the point is science is going to be crucial. Consumer trust in science is going to need to grow if that's to be achieved. And there's a real challenge here for brands and companies. Remember, we looked at lab-grown foods earlier, to sell in scientific solutions. Consumers remain really wrapped up in the idea that natural is pure, natural is something that appeals to them. The reality is natural is finite. Natural is about taking things out of the environment. Natural is about using resources from the environment. Natural runs against sustainability. If we can have synthetic or scientific solutions which are very resource efficient in that regard, or use closed loops, they are going to be the solutions we need to embrace. But there's clearly a lot of work to be done to position those to consumers. And when we talk about education, I want to take a little focus here on packaging at the moment. Brands have a responsibility to tell the truth about sustainability, to educate people on the realities. And I want to look at packaging as a focus here, because the majority of consumers simply do not understand the recyclability or biodegradability levels of different packaging materials. Look at these statements here at the top. Majority of consumers think that paper packaging is more environmentally friendly than plastic. That's simply not true. When we factor in all the water, the energy used to manufacture, transport those products, recycle them again. Most life cycle assessment analysis you conduct on a product would find that plastic probably had a lower environmental footprint. People tend to believe that any ocean plastic which is recovered can simply be repurposed into new food or drink packaging. They believe that biodegradable packaging will just break down if thrown away into a landfill. That's not the case. It needs high temperatures, it needs humidity for that to be achieved. They think compostable packaging can simply be thrown in the garden or the backyard and it will break down. Usually that's going to need to go to an industrial composting plant for that to happen. And they believe that anything that's got some recycled content again can be recycled again and again infinitely. Now, why wouldn't consumers believe this? They've not been taught anything else. Brands are doing a huge amount of launches with these claims without going into the specifics. And we need to see an end to this kind of opaque messaging, an end to the kind of empty marketing plays where brands will put, relaunched ocean plastic onto the market as a tiny proportion of their actual launches. All of this falls into the category of greenwashing. And a lot of brands at the moment are just focusing their attention of consumers on what they're doing with packaging. And as we've shown earlier, the big thing brands need to do is start talking about what they're doing with their energy. And we do see examples of brands doing this, but talking more about using renewable energy to make products as well. And so that's where this conversation will develop going forward. The final research I want to show you is some information which can help us understand how to better convince consumers to buy into our sustainable products and services. Let's hope that they are genuinely sustainable, and we've done that life cycle assessment as we talked about. So these are the factors that would encourage consumers to buy products or services that claim to benefit or protect the environment. And what the learning here is that you need to use simple lexicons, clear metrics, and prove the personal impact of buying an individual product. The biggest statement here, 48% of consumers want information on how the purchase of this particular product has had a direct impact. So maybe by buying this, you've saved a certain amount of emissions, or one tree has been planted as a result of you purchasing this product. They want labeling that shows the environmental impact of the product, how much carbon was emitted by this particular product, and that needs to be delivered in context as well. They want information in metrics they can understand. They want to understand, how many liters of water was used, or how many kilometers this has traveled. And they also, to a lesser degree, want certification to prove these standards as well. So to convert the potential into purchases, you need to use language and lexicons people can understand. Look at things like third-party accreditation, but confirm that individual impact. Right at the start of this presentation, I showed you that the majority of consumers still believe their behaviors can have a personal impact. The IEA data shows that 60% of the emissions reductions we need to achieve are linked, even indirectly, to consumer purchases and behavior. So at a product level, in your marketing, on your packaging, you need to prove what is being done in that regard. And it's all about how you do it as well. I want to show you some good examples here of people using clear metrics, people using proof of personal impact. Coco Kind, this beauty company here, if you see the reverse of this packaging, they're turning the small print into the large print. They're being very open, telling you that what the different emissions are at every stage of the product's life cycle. Typically, brands only talk about recyclability of things like packaging. Here, they're telling you the impact in the sourcing of the ingredients, the manufacturing, the distribution, and then the packaging at the end of life. What you're going to see in the UK and elsewhere is more and more brands voluntarily at the moment adopting things like eco scores, as we see here. This Mondra system is being trialed in the UK this autumn with participating brands, participating retailers, and it's very analogous to what we've seen with nutritional scores. You're going to get gradings, color-coded symbols which tell you how environmentally friendly or not this product is. And again, I know that the methodology here is like a life cycle assessment. They're looking at every stage of the product's life cycle. Finally, a good example here from the fashion industry from Reformation. When you're considering to buy one of their dresses or garments, they have information which tells you how much water was used to create that product, how much CO2 was emitted to create that product, so you can make an informed choice. And it compares that against the industry average. So the most sustainable thing you can do is not buy a new garment at all. Either buy a recycled one or buy something secondhand. But if you are going to, this allows you to make a comparative judgment in that regard. So to close, what are the routes to success? Sustainably minded consumers are the same as everyone else, only more so. And what I mean by that is that they prioritize budgets and convenience. Think about the red lines we said you couldn't cross. No one's going to start considering to buy a sustainable product unless it's really high quality, unless it's got brand familiarity, unless it's good value, and it delivers on convenience. People will not compromise on those areas. We also need to appeal to other non-sustainable characteristics. Is the product synonymous with healthy lifestyles? Is it going to help satisfy someone's ego or make them feel more of an individual? We've seen when it comes to people's concerns, it's a real case of seeing is believing. So with the solutions or the benefits of products or services or the actions we take as brands, let's make those tangible. Can we see those happening in our local environment? And there's a massive role for companies to play around education. As I mentioned, a lot of brands are getting away with greenwashing, getting away with doing empty marketing plays, acting in relatively low impactful areas, such as packaging. They need to educate consumers and be transparent on where their emissions come from. They also need to explain scientific solutions, scientific processes, and credit consumers with the intelligence to build understanding levels and to build trust with the brand. A brand like Patagonia, it's an obvious example to use, but they're one of the few brands which will tell you all the bad information and the impact of the products they're selling you. They're one of the few brands which will explain to you why they use plastic bags if they send a product out to you, and explain it has a lower environmental impact than not using the plastic bag. And again, when we looked at the metrics, the language, the lexicons, it's really a case to stop talking hot air. Use simple language, simple metrics people can understand. Don't try and bamboozle people. Be very clear in terms of that. And as we started out saying right at the beginning of this presentation, people do feel they can have a personal impact through their consumption patterns. So validate that, quantify that, at an individual purchase level, show people the impact they have had. So we've been looking at a lot of research here in our Sustainability Barometer. If you want to learn more about that, there are links available where you can download your free copy of that and dig into that data much more. So please do that after this presentation. And it's been my pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much.